Jai OPETAIA was the breakout star of this weekend, in my opinion, with his dominant performance over Jordan Thompson, knocking him out inside of 4 rounds away from home against a guy who was the much, much bigger man in this fight. And a lot of people beforehand were predicting Jordan Thompson to actually win very confidently. A lot of people saying he's going to go out there and he's going to be able to blast Jai OPETAIA out and that Jai isn't going to be able to stand up to his power. But what was so impressive about this performance is it ended up being completely the opposite of that. Jai was the one who was really actually able to intimidate Jordan Thompson. Jordan Thompson was scared in this fight. He didn't want to engage. He didn't want to come forward. He didn't want to let his shots go. Even though he had a significant height, reach, and weight advantage, he didn't want to actually engage. OPETAIA was able to come forward. He was able to land his shots and then get out of range before Jordan Thompson could do anything. Ultimately, he was able to impose his will on him both physically and mentally and get the stoppage in a hugely impressive win. And Jai is now going to be one of the breakout stars in a division where big fights can actually get made a lot more easily because the names in the division aren't so big that they can afford to sit on the sidelines and not get involved in the ring and not make these fights. So with all of that said, who's going to be next? And I think there are 2 names that seem to be on the table right now. MAIRIS in a rematch, and then a unification fight against one of the other champions. The name that keeps coming up in that regard, BILLAM-SMITH, who holds the WBO belt. So those seem to be the 2 names that are on the table right now. MAIRIS is the mandatory for the IBF, and apparently he took step-aside money in order to actually allow this fight to take place. So he's been waiting around now since the first fight in order to get his rematch against Jai, and so that's one option. And then the other option is unifying the belts. It seemed quite clear from the post-fight interviews that Jai wants to do that second route. He wants to go for the unification fights. I suspect as well he probably favors himself heavily against BILLAM-SMITH based on the way he performed in his last 2 fights, and then what we saw from CBS against Lawrence Okolie, where the fight was very ugly. It was a lot of holding, and that wasn't CBS's fault. That was Lawrence Okolie who was doing that. But the result of it wasn't really a pure boxing match. It was almost more, there was more holding actually in that fight than what you would see in the UFC. So it was really hard to get a handle on what does BILLAM-SMITH actually bring to the table. And I think as a result of that, Jai OPETAIA is going to probably favor himself, and a lot of people will favor him in that fight. So I think it makes sense that he's keen to try and take a fight that, in his mind, he's probably even more of a favorite than he would be over MAIRIS in the rematch, and he could potentially add the WBO belt to go alongside the IBF. But the question is which of those 2 fights is more likely. And based on what people are saying, it sounds like the MAIRIS fight might be the one that actually happens more quickly because MAIRIS is the mandatory with the IBF, number 1. Number 2, his promoters, the Sauerlands, were really hyping this fight up on Twitter, so it looks like they're going to do their best to actually enforce the mandatory, especially when they've already taken step-aside money, so they don't want to be waiting around forever. And MAIRIS is quite a bit older than Jai OPETAIA as well, so it makes sense that he's going to want that fight sooner rather than later. And then they were talking also about whether that fight would take place in the UK, in Australia, or I think it was probably more as a joke, but in Latvia. So realistically, that fight would probably take place either in Australia or the UK. MAIRIS against Jai OPETAIA. If that was to happen, it's still a very interesting fight because the first one was very close. The biggest difference in that fight was Jai OPETAIA's movement, the way he's able to get in and out of range, fighting on the front foot and then backing up, so that MAIRIS couldn't actually get in range and hit him with very much. But the fight was very close. I scored it 115 to 113 in favor of OPETAIA. And even though he fought the fight with a broken jaw and he's extremely tough, he did take some punishment even after that throughout the fight. So it wasn't just one shot. In the later rounds, Briedis was coming on and it was getting quite close. Even though OPETAIA dominated the first few rounds of the fight, it was closing, the gap was closing basically towards the end of the fight. And so if there's a rematch, Jai OPETAIA is going to be the favorite, and he deserves to be, especially because he's already beaten Briedis once. He's now come off a dominant victory over Jordan Thompson, so he is going to be the favorite. But to me, that fight is still interesting, and it is actually the one that I would prefer to see happen rather than the unification straight away. And the reason is that Briedis is not going to be around in the division for a long time, but he's been a champion who's fought so many of these top guys like Usyk and all of the other names in the cruiserweight division. I think he deserves this rematch. I think he deserves one more shot at the title. And it is still a close and it's still a dangerous fight. So don't think that just because Briedis lost the first time, that he's going to be even worse in the second one. And he does have the power advantage, I would argue, still over Jai. If you watch the first fight, it's BRIEDIS who's actually managing to hurt him more when he's landing the bombs. The difference in the fight is that Jai is able to land more frequently, and BRIEDIS didn't land quite enough to win enough of the rounds. But there were sequences in the fight where he manages to get his shots off, hit Jai, and it does cause damage. I mean, he broke his jaw. Both guys are extremely tough, so I'd say it's kind of even in that sense. Jai fought the whole fight with a broken jaw, but at this, and he also really has a chip on his shoulder as well. You can see that. So I think Jai OPETAIA, one of his X factors is he's really fighting with this chip on his shoulder. He's angry, he's hungry, and that's working in his favor. But MAIRIS BRIEDIS, I would say, is equally tough in his own right. He pretty much looked like his nose was broken in the first fight, which that didn't get talked about as much at the time. But the bottom line is he's also, I would say, just as tough as OPETAIA is. And so the difference is going to be, can MAIRIS BRIEDIS deal with Jai OPETAIA's movement? And if he can get close enough, can he land enough bombs to actually finish the fight this time? It's not out of the question that he could. So that fight, to me, out of the two options, is the one that I would actually prefer to see. And then if Jai OPETAIA wins, we can then go on to some of these unification fights. If you look at the other option, which is the Chris BILLAM-SMITH fight, I think that's probably less likely because Lawrence Okolie does have a rematch clause in the contract, so that fight definitely will be happening at some point, number one. But number two, I would actually like to see the Lawrence Okolie Chris BILLAM-SMITH rematch happen because the first fight was so close. I might be in the minority there because the first fight was extremely ugly. It was more of a wrestling match, mainly due to Lawrence Okolie's holding. But the bottom line is that fight was extremely close. Two of the knockdowns, of which there were three, were very debatable as to whether Okolie was actually hit by a punch. And at the same time, he was deducted points for holding, so he completely shot himself in the foot. But on the other hand, Chris BILLAM-SMITH is now going to be improved a lot as the champion. You can see the way he's carrying himself in interviews. He was even at ringside for this Jai OPETAIA-Jordan Thompson fight. He seems like a more confident guy now that he's the champion. And it's like Teddy Atlas likes to say, the champion sort of gains about 30% in confidence by winning the belt. So you're going to see a much more improved Chris BILLAM-SMITH, I think, in the rematch, but you're also going to see a much more improved Lawrence Okolie. And because the first fight was so close, it was for a world title, and because a belt actually changed hands, I think the rematch there is what I would actually like to see. So the ideal situation from my point of view would actually be to see Jai OPETAIA get to fight in his home country in Australia, maybe in a big stadium fight at this point, against MAIRIS BRIEDIS in the rematch. And then that way, if BRIEDIS loses, he'll have had two big shots against who's now considered to be the top guy in the division. Maybe at that point, BRIEDIS will look to retire. Maybe he'll fight on. But the bottom line is, I think he is a warrior who deserves one more shot at the championship. Maybe they can do that in Australia, in a big stadium, in front of Jai OPETAIA's home crowd. It will still be a close competitive fight where the Australian will be the favorite, but there is absolutely a chance that BRIEDIS could spring the upset there as well. So it's still close, it's still interesting. And then at the same time, we get the Okolie-BILLAM-SMITH rematch, and then the winner of that fight can look to fight Jai maybe early next year or maybe around March, April time. I think that would be the ideal situation, especially because you could have a fight in Australia, then you could have the Okolie-BILLAM-SMITH rematch in the UK, maybe around December, and then you could have around March, April time, this unification fight either in the UK or Australia. And by that point, both guys, whoever wins, are going to be built up to an even bigger level than they are now. So I think sometimes there's a danger, and we've seen this at heavyweight with Wilder and Joshua and other guys, of letting the fight simmer for too long, where it's now basically gone past the point where it's at its biggest point of buildup, basically. But in this case, I think Jai OPETAIA and a lot of these other cruiserweights, we can still build them up even more individually before these unification fights happen. And sometimes having all of the belts on one guy isn't the best thing for the sport, even though it does show you who's the number one in the division, because suddenly you only have one world title opportunity, and it can create a big backlog where you have contenders who are having to wait years for a shot at the champion. So there is advantages, I think, to having these individual belts still separate. And I think from that point of view, I would like to see these two separate fights happen. Then let's bring them together in March, April, and find out who's the best between all of these four guys: BRIEDIS, OPETAIA, Chris BILLAM-SMITH, Lawrence Okolie. Now I have to say, I think Lawrence Okolie shouldn't be underestimated in this mix either, because even though he really, really performed badly and in a very unfan-friendly way against CBS in the first fight. He's still incredibly talented. He still has a huge size and reach advantage over a lot of cruiserweights, including Jai Opetaia. And if he can just get over some of the spoiling tactics and not use them to such an extreme degree, he's still going to be a very dangerous, very difficult to beat fighter at cruiserweight. And at the end of the day, it's not out of the question that we actually see Lawrence Okolie be the one to unify all of these belts. But I think that's what makes it so interesting. So let me know in the comments, would you like to see Jai Opetaia unify against Chris BILLAM-SMITH right away, forget the rematch with BRIEDIS, or would you like to see BRIEDIS and Opetaia one more time in Australia? And whichever one happens, who do you think wins those two fights? Let me know in the comments. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel. I'll be posting boxing videos just like this 7 days a week, previewing fights, making predictions, and giving my opinions on the latest news. I really appreciate all of your support, and until next time, I am Brendan on Boxing, signing out.